What's up everyone? In this video we're going to be looking at what I consider to be my first proper aquascape. So before making this tank I definitely made a few scapes before, but when I made these it was very rushed. I went into the shop, bought all the plants, the hardscape, everything, the soil, all in one hit, took it home, put it together, and that was that. Now I didn't mind these scapes, but I definitely have learned since making them and since making this one that sometimes you just need a little bit more time to think out the scape and what you're going to do. So for this scape I actually bought all my tank and equipment and hardscape secondhand, which is something that I highly recommend to people if you're looking to save some money. I got the tank, which is a 60 by 45 by 45 centimeter, which is a 2 foot by 1.5 by 1.5 foot tank. Holds about 100 litres, just over 100 litres, so it's a pretty decent sized tank. With this tank I also got about 40 kilos of Cereus stone and a bunch of driftwood, and it also came with an Eheim Classic 350 and a Netlia AT5 light, which is a nice RGB light. The other thing was I had CO2 from my previous aquascape that I'd set up, and I decided I wanted to run inline CO2 to help me spread it out throughout the tank a bit better. So overall I got all this equipment for a pretty good price. It came with a cabinet which had some water damage, but it was about $700 Australian, which is pretty cheap. I think brand new this is probably cost closer to $1,500, $2,000. The one downside was though that because I got the hardscape from someone else, I didn't really get to check it out or pre-make anything in a dojo to play around with it. So I was sort of just given a bunch of hardscape and I had to make it work. So before setting up the scape properly, I decided to have a bit of a practice run. I had a rough idea of how I was going to use sort of the biggest bits of Cereus stone, and I put it in the tank to just have a little bit of a play. So after having a play around with the rocks and the stone, I had a rough idea of what I wanted to do. I knew I needed to create some height with the hardscape, as this was a pretty tall tank and I think it would look a bit weird if I wasn't able to get pretty close to the water's surface. So when making this hardscape, I used the usual tissue paper and cyanoacrylate liquid type glue. This forms a really nice little hard bond really quickly and is perfect for setting up hardscape. So after setting up the base sort of height and biggest part of the hardscape, I decided to make a sort of retaining wall with some of the smaller bits of Sirius stone. For this scape, I wanted to have sand at the front of the tank, and it was the first time I've ever done this, so I wanted to keep it neat and keep the aqua soil from rolling through. So I built up a few little pockets where I could put the plants and have a nice little barrier for the sand so it would stay clean. One of the reasons I wanted sand in this tank was I wanted cories for the first time, and so I thought it'd be nice to give them a big, nice section that went around the front and the side of the tank of sand for them to rummage around through. After I'd set up all the hardscape and the little retaining wall, it was time to get ready for the planting. So I'd put down my substrate. For the substrate, I decided to try the ADA Power Sand Advance. This was the first time I've ever used it, and I've used it in a few tanks since, and I quite like it. It gave me some really good, healthy, strong root growth, and I think it led to some great plant growth throughout the tank, so I'm very happy with it. On top of the Power Sand Advance, I added the Seachem Flourish root tabs, and then I pulled apart an old tank, so I used a little bit of my old UNS contra soil and some fresh UNS contra soil. My hope was that the old contra soil would help to boost the beneficial bacteria right from the start, but unfortunately I found that it didn't really help too much. I think it might have dried out a little bit too much and the bacteria might have died off, or there just wasn't simply enough for the Power Sand Advance and the new contra soil. So after I had the substrate system sorted, it was time for planting. Now with this tank, I had a few key plants that I really wanted. The main one was Laganandra. I really wanted a Laganandra in this tank, and I wanted the Meboldii red. But when I went to a local grower, he also had a silver powder Laganandra. So that was one of the main focal point plants, and I put it right front and center in the middle of the tank. In this same spot next to the Laganandra, we also had some Crypt Flamingo, which unfortunately melted away and I lost, which kind of sucks. And then next to that was also some Crypt Wenty Green, which I had from an old tank and I moved across, which also had a lot of melt and didn't quite recover that well. So now in the big mid-ground planting area, I planted the Laganandra Meboldii red, which absolutely flourished and was a beautiful plant in this tank, and I absolutely love it. After planting the Laganandra, I put in some Crypt Wenty Green from the old tank, just in these nice little shadowy parts. They went a little bit better, but still had some melt and kind of struggled as time went on. In the front of this mid-ground section, I planted a bunch of Blixa japonica. It's probably one of my favorite plants. I have it in a lot of my aquascapes and I really enjoy it. I sort of thought I wanted it to poke up above the bit of Sirius stone which was sticking up over the retaining wall and give that sort of grass-like look. And now we're on to the epiphytes. So I had a bunch of this Java Fern narrow growing in the bottom of another tank, and I was able to stuff it all over the hardscape. It was a perfect hardscape for this beautiful, beautiful Java Fern, and I think it grew really well and was very, very prominent. After adding the Java Fern, I added a lot of Anubias and Boost. So I added some Anubias Nana, some Anubias Nana Petite, some Anubias Pinto, some Anubias Jade, some Anubias Dragon Claw. I had some small Boosters. I had some gorgeous Boost Nanga Mahap, which was probably my favorite plant within the whole scape. It really, really was stunning. And also some Boost Super Blue. I attached all of these epiphytes with the cyanoacrylate gel type glue, and I glued them to the rocks and to the wood wherever I had to. And now onto the stems, and this tank was the first tank where I really got to play around with a lot of stems. I had a lot of space and I wanted to try a few different ones. So to start out with, I had some Rotala Blood Red, which has grown prolifically, and the Rotala from this tank has been put into many of my other tanks throughout the house. After the blood red, I planted some Rotala green. I wanted a little pop of green in the back there, so it was sort of edged with red, green in the middle, and then some more colors as it went along. after adding the Brutalas, it was time to plant the Pegostemon erectus. I really like the look of this plant, but unfortunately it melted away and I sort of struggled. From what I've read, it's not a great plant to start out with, as the high ammonia can make it melt. And finally, after the Pegostemon erectus, we had some Ludwigia inclinata verticulata cuba, and then some Ludwigia verticulata white. So the white was a really interesting plant. For a portion of the aquascape's life, it was really good. It was a very white and interesting plant, but it sort of got overshadowed and dominated by the other plants in the background there, and I think because it was a white plant it grew a bit slower, and eventually it just withered away because it wasn't able to keep up with all the other plants in the back. The Verticulata inclinata cuba grew really big and really beautiful. When it got to the surface, it had a gorgeous orange and green color. It was just fantastic, but unfortunately, because it's such a big plant, it looked a little bit out of place in this tank, and I have since got rid of it and sold off the last bits that I had because it was just too big for a lot of the aquascapes that I have. And finally, it was time to add the sand before filling up. So I rinsed off the sand so it was a bit wet, and I poured it in the front. I used a sort of more yellowy toned sand, and yeah, I think I put it in a little too thick, but this is how it's finally finished off. And I also added some scatter gravel to it. So here is the sort of final result of the aquascape about 6 to 7 months later. As you can probably see, there's a lot of different plants in the front that weren't in here before. There's some Pegostemon helferi, there is some Eriocaulon Vietnam, there is a bunch of Schismatoglottis petrioi, there's some Marsilia hirsuta and other stuff like that, which I put in just to sort of fill in some of the spaces. But overall, I'm pretty happy with how this aquascape turned out. I think it was a really good learning process about growing plants and keeping things healthy, and it also taught me a good lesson in making sure to trim and keep on top of the aquascape. I really was sort of scared of trimming and cutting this. I got the tank into balance, the algae sort of got pretty under control, and then I sort of sat back and said, well, that's it. I don't want to touch it, I don't want to mess with it, and it became this very messy looking, wild sort of look. And I think it worked for some points, worked for others. It was great for growing the plants, but overall I needed to be on top of it more. I needed to trim things, let different plants get more light. I needed to pull the Eriocaulon out because it got way too big and it just sort of created this big clump. So there are a few things that needed to change, but overall I'm very, very happy with how this scape turned out, how it sort of followed through and all that sort of stuff. Unfortunately, it is no longer together. I had to pull it apart when I was moving, but I will soon be making a new really nice simple layout in this tank. It's a beautiful tank, it's really big, it's really nice for a 2-foot tank, and I have a really nice piece of hardscape which I want to use to make a bit more of a minimalist scape here. So if you like the video, please make sure to subscribe and give the video a like. And if you're interested to see the new setup that's going to be going into this tank, yeah, make sure to stick around because I think it's going to be really awesome. It's some beautiful hardscape and I'm very excited to make it. I cannot wait. So thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.